What if the power to command a room has nothing to do with your title, your money, or your position, and everything to do with how you think? This audiobook reveals the hidden psychology behind the people who walk into any space and instantly become the center of gravity. Master this, and you will never enter a room the same way again. Picture two people walking into the exact same meeting. Same qualifications, same experience, same information to share. The first person enters, and within seconds, something shifts. Conversations soften. Eyes turn. People sit up a little straighter without even realizing why. The second person enters the same room, at the same time, wearing similar clothes, carrying similar credentials, and nothing happens. No shift, no gravity. They have to work to be noticed. And even then, the attention fades fast. What separated them wasn't intelligence. It wasn't beauty. It wasn't even confidence in the way most people define it. Some rehearsed posture or a firm handshake. What separated them was something deeper, something most people never learn to see, let alone develop. It was psychology. The first person had, whether they knew it or not, mastered a set of internal patterns that radiate outward as presence, and presence is the single most underrated currency in every room you will ever enter. Here is the truth almost nobody wants to admit. Power is not distributed by title. You have met managers who command no respect and interns who somehow have the whole office listening when they speak. You have watched a founder fumble through a pitch while their quiet co-founder said 4 sentences and closed the deal. Formal authority and psychological power are two completely different systems, and only one of them actually moves people. This audiobook is not about manipulation, and it is not about faking confidence until people believe a lie. Anyone can learn a few tricks and pull off a convincing performance for 10 minutes. That is not what we are building here. What we are building is the actual internal architecture, the thinking patterns, the speech patterns, and the physical and social instincts that powerful people run on without even having to think about it anymore, because it has become who they are. By the end of this audiobook, you will understand exactly why some people seem to bend a room around themselves without raising their voice, why others can sit in silence and still dominate a negotiation, and why a small number of individuals seem to move through life as though every door was built with them in mind. You will learn how they think before they ever open their mouth. You will learn how they speak, choosing words the way a surgeon chooses an incision. And you will learn exactly how they read and control the invisible dynamics of any room they walk into. From a boardroom to a first date, to a family dinner where the tension is thick enough to cut. This is not vague motivation. Everything you are about to learn is drawn from psychology, behavioral science, and the observable patterns of people who operate at the highest levels of influence, whether in business, politics, negotiation, or leadership. No fluff, no hollow affirmations, just the actual mechanics of power, broken down so you can install them into your own life, starting with how the most influential people on earth think when no one is watching. Chapter 1. The Room Test. Before we talk about speech, before we talk about body language, before we talk about anything visible at all, we have to talk about what happens on the inside, because everything visible is downstream of it. Powerful people pass what I call the room test, and most people fail it without ever realizing the test existed in the first place. Here is what the room test actually measures. When you walk into an unfamiliar space, full of people you do not know, your nervous system runs a silent calculation in the background. It is asking, consciously or not, do I belong here? Or am I an intruder? Do these people have something I need? Or do I have something they need? Am I here to be evaluated? Or am I here to evaluate? Most people, without ever noticing it, default to the first option in each pair. They walk in feeling like they need to earn their place, like they are being silently judged, like the room holds the power, and they are simply hoping to be accepted into it. Powerful people run the opposite calculation, and this is the entire foundation of everything else in this audiobook. They do not walk into a room asking to be accepted. They walk in already belonging. Because belonging, to them, is not something a room grants you. It is a decision you make before you ever cross the threshold. This is not arrogance. Arrogance is loud, insecure, and needs an audience to confirm it. This is something quieter and far more stable. It is the simple, settled belief that your presence adds value to any space you occupy, regardless of who else is in it. Think about why this matters so much. Every signal your body sends, the way you hold your shoulders, the pace of your steps, the openness of your expression, is generated by this underlying belief. You cannot fake belonging convincingly for long because the body leaks the truth. Someone who believes they need permission to exist in a room will unconsciously shrink, hesitate, over-apologize, and scan the room for approval. Someone who has already decided they belong will move at a natural pace, make eye contact without urgency, and take up exactly as much space as the moment calls for. No more, no less. This is why status and power so often diverge. A room full of executives will sometimes lean toward the quiet strategist in the corner rather than the loudest voice at the table, because loudness is frequently a symptom of needing to be noticed, while quiet certainty is a symptom of already knowing your value is not in question. The loud voice is running the old calculation, hoping to be accepted. The quiet strategist has already passed the room test internally and has nothing left to prove. So how do you actually pass the room test yourself? It starts before you ever open the door. Powerful people do a specific internal reset in the seconds before they enter a space. And you can train yourself to do the exact same thing. They ask themselves a different question than most people ask. Instead of asking, will they like me? They ask, what value am I bringing into this space? Instead of asking, will I say the wrong thing? They ask, what does this room actually need right now? And how can I provide it? This single shift, from self-focused anxiety to outward-focused value, changes everything about how your nervous system carries you through the door. There is a second layer to this as well, and it is one that almost nobody talks about. Powerful people separate their sense of worth from the outcome of any single interaction. If a room does not respond to them well, they do not internalize it as evidence that they are lesser. They treat it as information about the room, not a verdict on themselves. This separation is enormous because it means they can walk into high-stakes environments, boardrooms, negotiations, first meetings with people who could make or break an opportunity, without their nervous system flooding with the fear of personal annihilation if things go badly. And, paradoxically, this calm is exactly what makes rooms respond well to them in the first place. People are drawn to those who are not desperate for their approval, and repelled, often unconsciously, by those who are. If you want to start applying this immediately, here is where to begin. The next time you are about to enter a room that intimidates you, stop right before you walk in. Ask yourself honestly which calculation you are running. Are you asking whether you will be accepted, or are you asking what you bring to the table? If you catch yourself in the first mode, do not try to force confidence, because forced confidence is brittle and collapses under pressure. Instead, shift the question. Remind yourself of one specific, concrete thing you bring into that room that no one else in it can offer in quite the same way. It does not need to be dramatic. It can be as simple as your perspective, your calm, your specific expertise, or even just your willingness to ask the question everyone else is too afraid to ask. Anchor yourself in that one true thing, and let it be the thing you carry through the door instead of the fear of judgment. This is the foundation everything else in this audiobook is built on, because you cannot fake your way through the chapters that follow. The speech patterns, the frame control, the physical presence, none of it works as a costume. It only works as an expression of something that is actually settled inside of you first. And that settling begins the moment you stop asking a room for permission to exist in it. Chapter 2. Detachment from approval. There is a peculiar kind of freedom that almost every powerful person you have ever admired shares. And it has nothing to do with money, fame, or position. It is the freedom of not needing you to like them, not in a cold or dismissive way, but in a deeply settled, almost invisible way that changes the entire texture of how they move through the world. This chapter is about that freedom, why it is the single most important psychological shift, separating those who influence rooms from those who are simply present in them, and how you can begin building it in yourself. Most people are run, quietly and constantly, by the approval of others. It shows up in small ways you might not even notice you are doing. Softening an opinion because you sense the room disagrees. Laughing a little too hard at a joke that was not that funny. Agreeing to something you do not actually want to do because saying no feels like it will cost you social standing. Each of these moments seems small in isolation, but they compound into a pattern, and that pattern is visible to everyone around you, whether they can name it or not. People can feel when someone is performing for approval, even if they cannot articulate exactly what gives it away. And on some unconscious level, that neediness reads as a lack of power, because it signals that your sense of self depends on something outside your own control. Now contrast that with someone who has genuinely detached from approval. This does not mean they are rude, cold, or indifferent to others. In fact, the most powerful people are often remarkably warm and attentive. What it means is that their warmth is not a transaction. They are not being kind to you in order to extract your approval in return. They are kind because kindness is simply how they choose to move through the world. And if you do not respond to it well, their sense of self remains completely intact. This distinction between kindness offered freely and kindness offered as a bid for approval is one of the most important psychological differences in this entire audiobook, because the two can look identical on the surface and feel completely different underneath. Why does detachment from approval translate into so much influence? Because approval seeking is fundamentally a form of surrendering your position. Every time you shape your words, your opinions, or your behavior around what you think will make someone like you, you are handing them a small piece of control over your identity. And people, often without realizing it, sense this transfer of power happening in real time. It creates a subtle imbalance. The approval seeker becomes slightly subordinate in the dynamic, regardless of their actual title or role, because they have signaled that their sense of self can be moved by another person's reaction. Powerful people refuse to make that trade. They will listen. They will consider your perspective seriously, and they may even change their mind if you make a compelling case. But that is a decision made from evaluation, not a reflex triggered by the fear of disapproval. And the difference between those two things is felt by everyone in the room. There is a common misunderstanding here worth clearing up immediately. Detachment from approval is not the same as not caring what happens to other people. Some of the most influential figures in history were also deeply empathetic, attentive listeners who genuinely cared about the people around them. The detachment is specifically about your own identity and self-worth, not about your capacity for connection or compassion. You can care enormously about someone's well-being while still refusing to let their momentary opinion of you dictate who you are. In fact, this combination, deep care paired with total detachment from approval, is precisely what creates the magnetic quality so many powerful leaders share. People feel genuinely cared for by them, and simultaneously sense that this person cannot be manipulated through flattery or guilt, because their center of gravity lives inside themselves, not inside anyone else's reaction. So how is this actually built? It rarely happens overnight, and it is not simply a matter of deciding one day to stop caring what people think, because that kind of forced indifference tends to be brittle and often collapses into either genuine coldness or a thin performance that cracks under pressure. Real detachment from approval is built through repeated exposure to disapproval. Survived. Every time you say something honest and someone reacts negatively, and you discover that you are still fundamentally fine afterward, a small piece of evidence gets logged into your nervous system that disapproval is survivable. Over time, enough of these small, survived moments accumulate into a genuine, felt sense of security that does not depend on constant external validation. This is why powerful people often have a history of having weathered real criticism, real rejection, or real failure, and having come out the other side intact. It is not that they are naturally immune to caring what others think. It is that they have already tested the worst-case scenario in their own minds and found that it did not destroy them. If you want to build this in yourself, you have to be willing to create small, low-stakes versions of that same test. State an honest opinion in a setting where it might not be popular. Decline a request you genuinely do not want to fulfill, even if it disappoints someone. Wear, say, or do something slightly outside the consensus, and notice what actually happens afterward. In almost every case, you will discover the disapproval you feared was smaller, shorter, and far less catastrophic than your imagination predicted. And each time you survive it, the grip that approval holds over your behavior loosens just a little further. One more critical piece belongs in this chapter. Detachment from approval also means becoming comfortable with being misunderstood. Powerful people are frequently misread because anyone operating with genuine conviction will inevitably clash with someone else's expectations or assumptions at some point. The instinct to immediately clarify, over-explain, or defend yourself, the moment someone misunderstands you is, again, a form of approval seeking, a need to make sure everyone has a favorable and accurate picture of you at all times. Letting go of that instinct and trusting that your actions and consistency over time will speak more loudly than any single explanation could is one of the quietest and most powerful forms of psychological freedom you can develop. And it is one that almost every dominant figure in any room has, at some point, had to learn the hard way. Chapter 3. Frame Control. Every interaction between two or more people operates inside an invisible structure, a set of unspoken assumptions about who holds status, whose reality is the reference point, and whose version of events everyone else will orient around. Psychologists and social scientists sometimes call this a frame, and understanding frame control is one of the most powerful and least understood skills that separates those who quietly run rooms from those who simply occupy space inside them. Here is the simplest way to understand a frame. Imagine two people meet for the first time. One of them walks in, acting as though the other person's approval matters enormously, asking eager questions, laughing readily, subtly trying to prove their own value. The other person walks in, relaxed, curious, and evaluating the first person just as much as being evaluated themselves, without either person saying a single explicit word about status. A frame has already been established. The first person has, often unknowingly, adopted what is sometimes called a low-status frame, treating the other person's judgment as the reality that matters most. The second person is operating from a frame in which their own perspective is simply as valid, and neither person has to announce this out loud. It gets communicated entirely through subtle cues, tone, pacing, and the small choices each person makes about what to react to and what to let pass without comment. Powerful people are, whether consciously trained or intuitively gifted, master frame controllers. They understand that in almost every interaction, there is a subtle contest happening over whose frame the conversation will operate inside, and they have learned to hold their own frame steady rather than unconsciously absorbing someone else's. This does not mean dominating or overpowering the other person. The best frame control is often invisible, so smooth that neither party consciously registers it happening. It simply results in the powerful person's calm, their priorities, and their perspective becoming the gravitational center that the interaction organizes around. Let's look at a common real-world example. Someone challenges you in a meeting with a sharp, slightly aggressive question, clearly testing whether you will get defensive or flustered. A person without frame awareness will often unconsciously accept the frame being offered to them, which is, essentially, you are on trial here. Defend yourself. They speed up their speech, over-explain, and their body language shifts into a subtly submissive posture. A person with strong frame control recognizes what is happening and refuses to step into that frame. Instead of defending, they might pause, consider the question genuinely, and respond at their own natural pace, sometimes even reframing the question itself, saying something like, "That is an interesting way to look at it. Here is what I think is actually the more important question." In doing so, they have not fought the other person directly. They have simply declined to accept the frame being offered and replaced it with their own. And in most cases, the room follows. This brings us to one of the most important distinctions in frame control: reacting versus responding. Reacting is frame. Losing behavior. It means allowing someone else's words, tone, or energy to dictate your own emotional and behavioral state in real time. If someone raises their voice and you immediately raise yours in return, you have accepted their frame, the frame of escalation. Even though you might tell yourself you are simply matching their energy. Responding, by contrast, is frame-holding behavior. It means choosing your reaction deliberately from a place of internal stability, regardless of the energy being directed at you. This is why you will often notice that the most powerful person in a tense negotiation is frequently the calmest one in the room. Their calm is not a lack of feeling. It is frame control in action, a refusal to let someone else's urgency become their own. Frame control also shows up powerfully in how people handle compliments and criticism, two situations where most people unconsciously surrender their frame. When given an exaggerated compliment, many people deflect it nervously, undercutting themselves, saying something like, "Oh, it was nothing. I got lucky. Anyone could have done that." This might feel humble, but psychologically, it is a frame surrender, an implicit agreement that the compliment was too generous and needs correcting. A person with strong frame control simply accepts it, often with a brief, genuine thank you, without over-elaborating or minimizing, because they are not threatened by being seen accurately. The same logic applies to criticism. Someone without frame control often either collapses into defensiveness or over-apologizes at the first sign of pushback. Someone with frame control can hear criticism, genuinely consider whether it has merit, and respond from a place of evaluation rather than emotional reflex. Saying something like, "That is fair, let me think about that," rather than immediately scrambling to justify themselves. It is worth being direct about something here, because this chapter can easily be misunderstood. Frame control is not about winning every interaction or forcing your reality onto other people regardless of the truth. Used badly, these same principles can slide into manipulation or gaslighting, and that is not what we are teaching here. Genuine frame control is not about distorting reality. It is about refusing to let your own composure, your own sense of what matters, and your own internal reality be hijacked by someone else's emotional state or agenda. The most respected, trusted, powerful people you can think of use frame control to stay grounded and clear-headed under pressure, not to bulldoze other people's legitimate perspectives. So, how do you begin training this? Start by simply noticing frames in your everyday interactions, without trying to change anything yet. Notice when you feel your energy shift to match someone else's urgency, frustration, or excitement. Notice when you find yourself over-explaining or justifying something no one directly challenged. These are all small signals of frame surrender, and becoming aware of them is the first and most important step. Once you can spot it happening in real time, you can begin practicing the pause. Before reacting to any charged interaction, whether it is a compliment, a criticism, an aggressive question, or a heated moment, give yourself even half a second longer than feels natural before responding. That small gap is where frame control actually lives, because it is the space in which you choose your response deliberately instead of reacting automatically from whatever frame was just handed to you. Chapter 4. The cost of reacting. If you watch closely, you will notice that the people who seem to command the most respect in high-pressure environments almost never appear rattled, even when the situation genuinely calls for concern. This is not because they feel nothing. It is because they understand something that most people never learn, which is that reacting immediately, visibly, and emotionally to every piece of information is not a sign of engagement or authenticity. It is a cost, a leak of power that happens in real time, in full view of everyone watching. Think about the physiology of what happens when someone reacts strongly and immediately to bad news, criticism, or unexpected pressure. The face changes first, tightening, flushing, or going pale. The voice often rises in pitch or speeds up. The body tenses, shoulders creep toward the ears. Hands might fidget or clench. All of this happens involuntarily, in a fraction of a second, before the rational mind has even had time to process what actually occurred. And here is the critical part. Everyone else in the room sees it happen. In that instant, information has been transmitted about the internal stability of that person, and it is rarely flattering information. It signals that events outside their control can immediately hijack their composure, and on some deep, ancient level, that reads as weakness, because it suggests an inability to remain steady under threat. Powerful people train themselves, sometimes deliberately, sometimes through sheer, repeated exposure to high-stakes situations, to create a gap between stimulus and reaction. This gap is not about suppressing emotion or pretending not to feel anything. Suppression is exhausting and eventually leaks out sideways in far less controlled ways. What we are talking about here is something different. Creating just enough space between what happens and how you visibly respond to it, that your response becomes a choice rather than a reflex. In that gap lives an enormous amount of power, because it is where discernment happens. Is this actually as bad as it initially seems? Does this news require an immediate reaction? Or can it be absorbed, considered, and responded to on your own terms and your own timeline? Most people never ask these questions because their nervous system has already answered for them before their conscious mind even had a chance to weigh in. Consider the classic example of receiving unexpected criticism in front of others. The instinctive human reaction is defensiveness, a fight or flight response that floods the body with the urge to justify, explain, or counterattack immediately. Someone who reacts on pure instinct will often start speaking before they have even fully processed what was said. And this rushed response is almost always worse than a considered one, both in its actual content and in how it is perceived by others. Now picture someone who has trained themselves to sit in that gap for even 2 or 3 extra seconds. They let the criticism land fully. They notice the urge to react defensively, and they let that urge pass through them without acting on it immediately. Then, from a place of genuine consideration, they respond, sometimes with agreement, sometimes with a clarifying question, sometimes with a calm and measured pushback. The content of what they say might end up being similar to what the reactive person would have said eventually, but the manner in which it arrives completely changes how it lands and how the room perceives the person delivering it. There is a particularly important nuance here about the difference between suppressing a reaction and metabolizing one. Suppression means forcing your face and voice into neutrality, while the emotional charge remains fully active underneath, unprocessed. This is unsustainable and often visible anyway, because micro-expressions and subtle tension leak out even when someone is trying hard to hide them. And people are remarkably good at unconsciously detecting incongruence between what someone says and what their body is actually doing. Metabolizing a reaction is different. It means actually processing the emotional charge internally, often through a brief redirection of attention, a breath, a reframe, before you speak or act. The visible calm of a powerful person is not usually a mask covering internal chaos. In most cases, by the time they respond, the internal chaos has already been genuinely, if briefly, worked through, which is precisely why their composure holds up under continued pressure rather than cracking a few moments later. This has enormous implications for how you handle bad news, unexpected setbacks, and confrontation in your own life. The instinct in the moment is almost always to respond immediately, because silence or delay can feel uncomfortable, even threatening. But consider what an immediate reaction actually costs you. It commits you to a response formed under the worst possible conditions, when your thinking is narrowest and your emotional state is least stable. It broadcasts your internal state to everyone watching, handing them information about exactly how to affect you in the future. And it forecloses the possibility of a better, more strategic response that might have been available if you had simply given yourself a few more seconds, minutes, or in some cases, even a day, to actually think. Building this capacity starts small. The next time something mildly frustrating or unexpected happens, whether it is a piece of critical feedback, a minor setback, or an unwelcome piece of news, practice deliberately delaying your outward response, even by just a handful of seconds. Notice the urge to react instantly, and instead of acting on it, simply observe it. Ask yourself internally what actually happened, separate from your emotional interpretation of it. Then, and only then, decide how you want to respond. Over time, this practice compounds. What begins as a forced, effortful pause gradually becomes a natural rhythm, until eventually, without having to think about it consciously at all, you find yourself naturally responding to pressure from a place of choice rather than reflex, which is exactly the quality that makes powerful people appear so unshakable under conditions that would visibly rattle almost anyone else. Chapter 5. The Illusion of Effort. There is a strange and consistent pattern you will notice if you study people who operate at the highest levels of influence and power. They rarely look like they are trying very hard. Watch a truly skilled negotiator close a deal, a masterful public speaker hold an audience, or a respected leader diffuse a tense meeting, and you will often notice an almost unsettling ease to how they do it. Meanwhile, someone with less actual skill in the same situation will visibly strain, over-explain, over-gesture, and radiate effort from every pore. This chapter is about why that visible ease is not an accident, why it is often the single most persuasive quality a person can project, and how it is actually built, because it is almost never a natural gift. Human beings are wired, likely for deep evolutionary reasons, to associate visible strain with lower status and effortless competence with higher status. Think about it instinctively. Someone who has to work hard, visibly and obviously, to accomplish something signals that the task is at, or perhaps even slightly beyond, the edge of their actual capability. Someone who accomplishes the same thing with apparent ease signals that they have significant capacity in reserve, that what you are witnessing is well within their range, not the outer limit of it. This is precisely why effortless competence reads as more impressive than visibly strained competence. even when the actual outcomes achieved are identical. This shows up constantly in how people speak. Someone who is nervous about being judged tends to over-explain, adding qualifier after qualifier, justifying their point from multiple angles because they are worried a single, clean statement will not be sufficient or will be picked apart. Ironically, this over-explanation almost always weakens their position rather than strengthening it, because it signals uncertainty and effort. A person operating with genuine ease will often say considerably less, trusting that their point, stated clearly and without excessive justification, carries enough weight on its own. There is a reason that some of the most quoted, most repeated statements from powerful figures throughout history tend to be short. Brevity, when it comes from genuine confidence rather than curtness, reads as mastery, because it implies the speaker has so much command over the subject that they do not need to prove it through volume of words. The illusion of effort, or, more accurately, the illusion of effortlessness, extends into physical presence as well. Watch someone who is anxious in a room, and you will often see excessive movement, adjusting their clothing, touching their face, shifting their weight, filling silence with unnecessary sound. Watch someone who has genuinely mastered their presence, and you will often see the opposite, a kind of physical economy, where movements are deliberate rather than compulsive, and stillness is comfortable rather than something to be nervously filled. This economy of movement is not about suppressing natural expressiveness. Powerful people are not statues. It is about the absence of anxious, filler movement that has no communicative purpose and exists only to discharge nervous energy. Here is the part of this chapter that matters most, because it is easy to look at all of this and conclude that effortlessness is simply an innate trait some people are lucky enough to have been born with. That conclusion is almost always wrong. The apparent ease you see in genuinely skilled, powerful people is, in the overwhelming majority of cases, the product of an enormous amount of prior effort that has simply become invisible through repetition. A negotiator who appears relaxed and unbothered during a high-stakes deal has, in most cases, been through dozens or hundreds of prior negotiations, has made the mistakes already, has felt the anxiety already, and has built enough pattern recognition that what looks effortless in the moment is actually the automated result of deeply internalized skill. This is true of virtually every domain of visible mastery. The effort was real. It simply happened earlier, and enough times, that it no longer needs to be visible in the moment of performance. This distinction matters enormously for how you approach building your own presence, because it means the goal is not to fake effortlessness before you have actually earned it. Faked ease, without the underlying competence to support it, tends to collapse the moment real pressure is applied, revealing itself as a thin performance rather than genuine mastery. What you are actually working toward is a specific kind of preparation, deliberate, repeated exposure to the situations that currently make you feel strained until your nervous system files them as familiar rather than threatening. The visible ease follows naturally once the underlying competence and pattern recognition are actually in place. You cannot skip this step, but you can accelerate it dramatically by being intentional about it rather than leaving it to chance. There is also a mental component worth naming directly. Part of what creates visible strain, even in people who are technically skilled enough to handle a given situation, is the belief that they need to prove their competence in real time, in front of the very people they are trying to influence. This belief creates a kind of performance anxiety layered on top of the actual task. And that layered anxiety is often what produces the visible effort more than any genuine gap in ability. Powerful people, through experience or through deliberate mental training, separate the task itself from the need to prove themselves while doing it. They focus entirely on the task, trusting that competence, once actually built, does not need to be performed or announced. It simply becomes visible on its own, in the results, and in the calm with which those results are produced. This is often the final and most difficult piece to install, because it requires genuinely believing that your worth is not on trial in every single interaction, a belief that connects directly back to the detachment from approval we explored earlier in this audiobook, and that will continue to surface again and again as we move deeper into how powerful people speak and command the rooms around them. If you want a practical way to begin building this in your own life, start by identifying one specific situation that currently produces visible strain in you. A type of conversation, a type of room, a type of pressure that reliably makes you over-explain, over-move, or over-perform. Instead of avoiding that situation, as most people instinctively do, seek out smaller, lower-stakes versions of it deliberately and repeatedly. If public speaking rattles you, do not wait for the big presentation to be your first real attempt at composure. Practice in front of a handful of people first, then a slightly larger group, then a slightly higher stakes room, each time paying close attention not to the content of what you are saying, but to the physical and verbal signs of strain you are producing, and gently working to reduce them one repetition at a time. This is slow, unglamorous work, and it will not feel like power while you are doing it. But it is precisely this accumulation of survived, familiar repetition that eventually produces the effortless quality you are aiming for. And by the time you reach the high-stakes version of that situation, your nervous system will have already quietly filed it under familiar rather than threatening, which is the entire secret behind the ease that looks, from the outside, like something people were simply born with. Chapter 6. The Power of Silence. Most people are terrified of silence. Watch any ordinary conversation and you will notice a strange, almost compulsive pattern. The moment a pause stretches even a second or two longer than expected, someone rushes to fill it. They repeat themselves, add an unnecessary qualifier, ask a question they do not actually need answered, or blurt out a thought they had not fully formed yet. All because the silence itself has become unbearable. Powerful people operate by a completely different relationship with silence. And understanding that relationship is where our exploration of how they speak actually has to begin. Because in many ways, silence is the foundation. Everything else in this chapter and the ones that follow is built on top of. Here is the core insight almost nobody teaches directly. Silence is not empty. It is not a gap that needs to be filled. It is, in the hands of someone who understands how to use it, one of the most loaded and communicative tools available in any conversation. When a powerful person pauses before answering a question, that pause communicates something specific. This question deserves genuine consideration, not a reflexive, pre-packaged response. When they let a moment of tension sit in a room without immediately rushing to smooth it over, That restraint communicates something else entirely. I am comfortable enough in this moment that I do not need to manage everyone else's discomfort. Both of these are enormously powerful signals, and neither of them requires a single word. Consider what happens physiologically and socially when silence enters a room. Human beings are deeply uncomfortable with unstructured social space because our nervous systems evolved in small groups where silence could sometimes signal danger, exclusion, or unresolved conflict. This discomfort is so deeply wired that most people will do almost anything to avoid sitting inside it, including saying things they do not fully mean, agreeing to things they had not intended to agree to, or revealing information they had not planned on sharing, purely to relieve the pressure of an unfilled pause. Skilled negotiators, therapists, interrogators, and leaders have all, in their own domains, discovered some version of the same principle. Whoever is most comfortable with silence in a given interaction typically ends up holding more control over how that interaction unfolds, because the other party will frequently move to fill the space, revealing their position, their urgency, or their true priorities in the process. This does not mean powerful people are simply withholding speech as a manipulation tactic, waiting silently to bait others into talking. Used that way, silence quickly curdles into something manipulative and cold, and people tend to sense it, even if they cannot articulate exactly what feels off. The genuine version of this skill is subtler and more honest. It is simply the willingness to let a pause exist, because rushing to fill it would produce a worse outcome, whether that means a less considered answer, a less honest reaction, or an unnecessary concession made purely to escape discomfort. The silence is not a weapon aimed at someone else. It is a boundary held around your own composure, a refusal to let social pressure dictate the pace or content of your speech. Think about how this plays out after making a request, particularly in negotiation. A common and costly mistake is asking for something, whether it is a raise, a better price, or a more favorable term in a deal, and then immediately following it with a nervous explanation, a justification, or worse, a preemptive softening of the ask before the other party has even had a chance to respond. This habit, sometimes called negotiating against yourself, comes directly from an inability to tolerate the silence that follows a bold statement. Powerful negotiators understand that the silence after a request is doing important work. It gives the other party space to actually process what was asked. And often, if you can tolerate the discomfort of waiting, the other party will be the one to break the silence, sometimes with a counter that is more favorable than you might have gotten if you had rushed to fill the gap yourself with unnecessary concessions. There is also a version of this that shows up in emotionally charged conversations, and it is worth examining closely because it reveals something deeper about what silence actually communicates. When someone is upset, angry, or in pain, the instinct for most people is to immediately respond with reassurance, solutions, or defense, anything to move the conversation out of the uncomfortable emotional territory as quickly as possible. But often, what the other person actually needs in that moment is simply to be heard, fully, without their emotional expression being cut short by someone else's discomfort. A powerful communicator can sit inside someone else's difficult emotion without rushing to fix it, resolve it, or talk over it. This capacity to remain present and silent while someone else feels something intense is frequently what makes people describe certain individuals as remarkably calming or trustworthy to talk to, even if that person said comparatively little during the exchange. Building this capacity requires directly confronting your own discomfort with unfilled space, because most people avoid silence not out of any calculated strategy, but out of pure, automatic anxiety. Start noticing, in your everyday conversations, the specific moments where you feel the urge to speak, simply to relieve tension, rather than because you have something genuinely necessary to say. Practice letting a pause stretch 1 or 2 seconds longer than feels comfortable before responding, particularly after being asked a meaningful question or after making an important statement of your own. It will feel unnatural at first, even mildly agonizing, but over repeated practice, that discomfort fades, and what replaces it is a new kind of ease, the same ease we discussed in the previous chapter, now applied specifically to the rhythm and pacing of speech itself. Once you can hold silence without flinching, you gain access to a level of conversational control that almost nobody around you will have, because almost nobody else has done the work of making peace with the pause. There is one more dimension of silence worth exploring before we move forward, and it concerns how powerful people use silence not just reactively, in response to a question or a tense moment, but proactively, as a way of signaling that a conversation or a particular topic has reached its natural conclusion. Most people struggle to end conversations cleanly, tacking on unnecessary closing remarks, restating points that have already been made, or lingering in a kind of conversational limbo because ending things decisively feels abrupt or even rude. A powerful communicator, having made their point and having genuinely heard the other party's response, is comfortable allowing a natural silence to signal closure, rather than manufacturing extra words simply to soften the transition out of a conversation. This same comfort with closing silence extends to meetings, negotiations, and even everyday exchanges, and it consistently reads as a kind of quiet decisiveness, a sense that this person's time and attention are valuable enough that they do not need to be padded out with unnecessary conversational filler at the end of every exchange. There is also a specific application of silence worth mentioning in the context of receiving bad news or unexpected setbacks in real time. The instinctive reaction when someone delivers unwelcome information is to respond immediately, often with a question, an objection, or a visible display of concern, because staying silent in that moment can feel like a failure to react appropriately. But powerful people frequently allow a brief silence to follow bad news before responding, not because they do not care, but because that silence gives them a moment to actually process the information rather than reacting to their first, often unhelpful emotional impulse. This brief pause also has a secondary effect worth noting. It often causes the person who delivered the news to fill the silence themselves, sometimes offering additional context, a potential solution, or a softening of the original statement. Information that would never have surfaced if the listener had rushed to fill the silence with their own immediate reaction instead. Chapter 7. Saying less to gain more. If silence is the space around speech, this chapter is about what happens inside that speech itself. Specifically, the counterintuitive discovery that the fewer words you use, the more weight each one tends to carry. Most people believe that persuasion requires volume, more explanation, more evidence, more repetition of the same point from slightly different angles. as though sheer quantity of words will eventually wear down resistance. Powerful communicators have almost universally learned the opposite lesson. Precision beats volume, and restraint beats repetition. Consider why over-explanation backfires so consistently, even though it feels, in the moment, like the responsible and thorough thing to do. Every additional sentence you add after making your core point does two things simultaneously. First, it dilutes the impact of the original statement, because the listener's attention naturally settles on whichever part of what you said felt most confident and complete, and a string of qualifiers or additional justifications afterward signals, even if only subconsciously, that the original statement was not quite sufficient on its own. Second, and just as importantly, over-explanation gives the listener more material to poke holes in. A single, clean, well-considered statement is a small target. A long, meandering justification is a large one, and the more you say, the more surface area you create for doubt, objection, or misinterpretation to attach itself to. This is precisely why so many of the most quoted lines from history's most respected leaders, negotiators, and thinkers tend to be remarkably short. Brevity is not a stylistic accident. It reflects a genuine command of the underlying idea, because compressing a complex thought into a small number of precise words requires having actually metabolized that thought fully first. Someone who deeply understands their own position can usually state it briefly. Someone who is still uncertain, or who has not fully thought their position through, tends to need many more words to arrive at something resembling clarity, circling the point repeatedly rather than landing on it directly. There is an important distinction here worth making explicit, because saying less does not mean saying nothing of substance, and it certainly does not mean being cold, curt, or dismissive. The goal is not brevity for its own sake. It is the elimination of unnecessary words, the ones that exist purely to soften, hedge, or pad a statement out of nervousness, rather than because they add genuine meaning. Phrases like, "I could be wrong about this, but," or "this might not make sense," or "sorry if this is a silly question," are almost always unnecessary hedges that weaken an otherwise perfectly reasonable statement or question. Removing them does not make your communication harsher. It simply removes the apologetic noise surrounding the actual content, allowing that content to be heard clearly on its own terms. This principle extends powerfully into how requests and boundaries are communicated. A request buried under multiple layers of justification, apology, and qualification often reads as uncertain, even desperate, regardless of how reasonable the underlying ask actually is. Compare a request phrased as, "I was wondering if maybe," if it is not too much trouble, and only if it works for you, whether you might possibly be able to look at this by Friday, with a request phrased simply as, "I need this by Friday. Could you confirm?" That works. The second version is not rude. It is simply clear, and clarity, delivered without unnecessary apology, reads as confidence rather than demand. People consistently respond better to clear, direct requests than to heavily padded ones, in part because the padding itself introduces ambiguity about how seriously the request should actually be taken. The same logic applies powerfully to how powerful people deliver difficult news or hold boundaries. Someone lacking this skill will often bury an unwelcome message inside. So many cushioning statements that the actual message becomes genuinely unclear, leaving the listener confused about what was actually decided or communicated. A powerful communicator delivers the difficult message clearly and directly, often with genuine warmth and empathy in tone, but without diluting the actual content through excessive hedging. This might sound like, "I understand this is disappointing," and the decision has already been made, rather than a long, meandering explanation that leaves the listener unsure whether the door is actually closed or still slightly open. Counterintuitively, this directness, even when delivering unwelcome news, tends to be received as more respectful than a heavily padded version, because it treats the listener as someone capable of handling clear information rather than someone who needs to be carefully managed around the truth. Building this skill requires becoming ruthlessly aware of your own verbal padding, which can be difficult because most of it operates entirely below conscious awareness, triggered by the same approval-seeking and discomfort with silence we explored earlier in this audiobook. A useful practice is to mentally draft what you want to say. Then go back through it and identify every word or phrase that exists purely to soften rather than to add genuine information, and experiment with removing it. At first, the resulting statement will often feel uncomfortably blunt, even though, to an outside listener, it usually sounds simply clear and confident rather than harsh. Over time, as you practice this compression repeatedly, it becomes less something you have to consciously construct and more something that happens naturally. And at that point, you will notice something remarkable. People begin listening more closely when you speak, not because you are saying more, but precisely because you have trained yourself to only say what actually needs to be said. It is worth adding a final note here about the difference between saying less in general conversation and saying less at the specific moments that matter most, because these are not quite the same skill. Powerful communicators are not necessarily silent or terse across an entire conversation. Many of them are warm, engaged, even talkative in relaxed settings. What distinguishes them is their instinct for recognizing which particular moments within a longer exchange actually carry weight, and compressing their language specifically around those moments while allowing themselves to be more expansive elsewhere. This selective precision is, in some ways, more important than blanket brevity, because a person who is simply terse at all times risks reading as cold or disengaged, while a person who knows exactly when to tighten their language reads as someone with genuine command over the conversation structure. Someone who understands, intuitively, which sentences are load-bearing and which are simply connective tissue. Chapter 8. Tonality, the instrument beneath the words. Words carry meaning, but tonality carries authority. And this is one of the most overlooked dimensions of powerful communication, because most people focus almost entirely on what they are going to say and give almost no conscious attention to how it will actually sound when it leaves their mouth. This chapter is about the instrument beneath the words, the pitch, pace, rhythm, and resonance of your voice, and why mastering it is one of the fastest ways to dramatically shift how a room responds to you, often independent of the actual content being spoken. Consider a simple experiment you have likely witnessed without fully naming it. Two people say the exact same sentence, word for word, in a meeting. One says it quickly, with a slight upward inflection at the end, as though the statement were actually a question seeking approval. The other says, the identical sentence slowly, with a slight downward inflection, landing the final word with weight rather than letting it trail off uncertainly. Despite the words being identical, these two deliveries are received completely differently. The first reads as tentative, even if the content itself was perfectly reasonable. The second reads as a settled statement of fact. This is the power of tonality, and it operates almost entirely beneath conscious awareness for most listeners, who will walk away with a strong impression of confidence or uncertainty without ever consciously registering that the impression came primarily from vocal delivery rather than content. The upward inflection at the end of a statement, sometimes called uptalk, deserves particular attention here because it is one of the most common and most damaging habits that undermines perceived authority, and it is almost entirely unconscious in the people who do it. This pattern turns statements into what sound like questions, subtly signaling to the listener that the speaker is seeking validation for what they just said, rather than simply stating it. It is worth recording yourself speaking in a normal conversation at some point and listening back specifically for this pattern, because most people are genuinely unaware of how frequently they do it until they hear it played back to them directly. Training yourself to let statements end with a flat or slightly downward tone, rather than trailing upward, is one of the single highest leverage changes you can make to how authoritative you sound, and it requires no change to your actual vocabulary or content whatsoever. Pace matters just as much as pitch. Nervous speech tends to accelerate. Words tumbling out faster than the speaker's thoughts can actually keep pace with, which is precisely why anxious speakers often stumble, lose their train of thought, or trail off mid-sentence. Powerful speakers, by contrast, tend to slow down, particularly at the moments that matter most within a statement. This is not about speaking slowly throughout an entire conversation, which can come across as strange or condescending. It is about strategic pacing, slowing down specifically around the core of an important point, and allowing that slower pace to communicate that this particular idea deserves the listener's full attention, rather than rushing through it as though it was simply one more piece of information among many. Resonance and volume deserve mention as well, though this is an area where people frequently misunderstand what actually projects authority. Speaking loudly is not the same as speaking with authority. And in fact, raised volume without corresponding lower pitch and slower pace often reads as aggression or anxiety rather than genuine command of a room. What actually reads as authoritative is a voice that comes from lower in the chest rather than higher in the throat, producing a fuller, more grounded resonance combined with volume that is simply sufficient to be heard clearly and comfortably, without straining. If you have ever noticed that some people seem to command a room while speaking at what feels like a completely ordinary volume, this is usually why. Their vocal resonance and pacing are doing the work that volume alone cannot accomplish. There is also an emotional dimension to tonality worth exploring directly, because voice carries emotional information whether or not the speaker intends it to. Anxiety produces a thin, higher-pitched, faster quality of speech almost universally across cultures, because it is tied to physiological arousal that tightens the vocal cords and speeds the breath. This means that even when someone is saying calm, measured words, if their underlying emotional state is anxious, that anxiety often leaks through in the voice, regardless of the content being spoken. This is precisely why we discussed metabolizing emotional reactions in the previous act of this audiobook, because genuine vocal calm is extremely difficult to fake convincingly if the underlying nervous system state has not actually settled first. The good news is that this relationship runs in both directions, deliberately slowing your breath and lowering your vocal pitch, even before you feel calm internally, can actually help produce genuine calm as a physiological response, which is why many public speaking and performance coaches teach vocal and breathing techniques as a direct pathway to managing anxiety in high-pressure speaking situations, rather than treating the calm voice as something that can only follow after internal calm has already been achieved. Building command over your own tonality starts with awareness, because most people have simply never listened closely to how they actually sound. Record yourself speaking in both low-stakes and higher-stakes conversations if possible, and listen back specifically for uptalk, pace, and pitch. Notice where your voice speeds up or rises when you are least confident about what you are saying, and practice deliberately slowing and lowering your delivery, specifically in those moments. Over time, this awareness translates into a kind of vocal discipline that operates automatically, allowing your voice to consistently communicate the steadiness and authority that words alone, no matter how well chosen, can never fully convey on their own. It is also worth noting that tonality is not a fixed, one-size-fits-all target, and attempting to force your natural voice into an artificially deep or slow register across every situation tends to backfire, producing something that sounds stilted or performed, rather than genuinely authoritative. The goal is not to imitate a particular vocal archetype. It is to remove the specific patterns, the uptalk, the rushed pace, the thin breath, that are actively working against whatever your natural voice already has to offer. Everyone's baseline voice carries its own capacity for authority once the anxious patterns layered on top of it are cleared away, and part of the work here is genuinely distinguishing between your natural vocal instrument and the nervous habits that have, over years of anxious or hurried speech, come to obscure it. One further layer worth understanding is how tonality interacts with congruence, the alignment between what your voice is doing and what your words and body are simultaneously communicating. A confident sentence delivered in a thin, hurried voice creates a kind of dissonance that listeners register even when they cannot name it precisely, a sense that something about the delivery does not quite match the content. This dissonance erodes trust far more than most people realize, because human beings, evolutionarily, learn to weigh tone and nonverbal cues more heavily than literal words when judging whether someone could be trusted, since words can be rehearsed or false, while tone is far harder to fully control. This is precisely why the internal work covered earlier in this audiobook, the genuine detachment from approval, the settled sense of belonging in a room, matters so much to the material in this chapter. You cannot fully separate vocal mastery from the underlying psychological state producing it, because eventually, under enough pressure, the voice will reveal whatever is actually happening underneath, no matter how much technical training has been layered on top. Chapter 9. The Art of the Pause. We have already discussed silence as a broader principle. The willingness to let space exist in a conversation without rushing to fill it. This chapter narrows that principle into something more specific and immediately practical: the strategic use of the pause within your own speech, a tool that, once mastered, becomes one of the most reliable ways to make any statement land with significantly more weight and authority. Most people speak in an unbroken stream, one sentence flowing directly into the next with barely a breath between them, as though any gap in the flow of speech might invite interruption or signal a loss of momentum. This habit is understandable, particularly in fast-paced environments where people are used to competing for airtime. But it comes at a real cost. Continuous, unbroken speech gives the listener no natural place to actually absorb what is being said. Ideas blur together, and even genuinely important points can slip past unnoticed, simply because they were not given any structural emphasis within the flow of speech to signal their importance. The strategic pause solves this problem directly. When a powerful speaker wants a particular point to land with weight, they will often pause, briefly, immediately before delivering it, and sometimes, again, immediately after. This is not hesitation, and it is critically important to distinguish it from the anxious, filler-laden pausing of someone who has lost their train of thought or is unsure what to say next. A strategic pause is deliberate and controlled. It functions almost like a spotlight, signaling to the listener's attention, without a single word being spoken, that whatever comes next deserves particular focus. Think of how a skilled storyteller pauses right before revealing a key detail, or how an experienced speaker goes silent for a beat right after making their most important point, allowing it to settle into the room rather than immediately rushing on to the next thought and burying its impact. There is a particular version of this worth highlighting directly, sometimes called the power pause, which occurs immediately after asking a question or making a request, precisely at the moment when the instinct to fill silence is strongest. We touched on this in the context of negotiation earlier, but it deserves emphasis here as a specific speech technique in its own right. After asking a meaningful question, resist the urge to immediately add clarification, rephrase the question, or offer the other person an easy out. Let the question exist in the room, fully, and allow the other person the space to actually engage with it. This can feel excruciatingly uncomfortable the first several times. You practice it deliberately, but it consistently produces more thoughtful, more honest responses than rapid-fire questioning ever does, precisely because it signals that you are genuinely interested in their answer rather than simply moving through a script. Pausing also plays a crucial role in how powerful people handle interruption and reclaim control of a conversation without becoming aggressive about it. When someone talks over another person, the instinctive reaction is often to either immediately go silent and yield the floor, or to talk louder and faster in an attempt to power through the interruption. Both of these reactions tend to escalate tension or signal a loss of control. A more skilled approach involves pausing completely the moment an interruption begins, allowing a brief, slightly uncomfortable silence to occur, which frequently causes the interrupting party to notice what they have done and pull back on their own, without a single word of confrontation being necessary. Then, calmly and without rushing, the original speaker can resume exactly where they left off, often with a slight, deliberate pause before continuing, which further reinforces the sense that they were never actually destabilized by the interruption in the first place. It is worth being honest about how uncomfortable this entire chapter's core skill is to practice, because pausing deliberately, particularly in the early stages of building this habit, will feel unnatural and even slightly performative. This discomfort fades with repetition, in the same way that tolerating silence between speakers eventually stops feeling agonizing and starts feeling simply natural. A useful way to begin is to identify before entering any important conversation, one specific point you plan to make, and deliberately plan a pause immediately before delivering it. Do not worry, at first, about doing this fluidly throughout an entire conversation. Simply practice it around a single planned moment, and notice both how it feels to execute and how differently that particular point seems to land compared to points you deliver without any surrounding pause. Over time, as this becomes more familiar, you will find yourself using pauses more instinctively throughout your speech, no longer as a rehearsed technique, but as a natural rhythm, one that consistently gives your words room to actually be heard, rather than simply passing by in an undifferentiated stream. There is a subtle but important warning worth including here, because pausing, like every technique in this audiobook, can be overused or applied mechanically in a way that undermines its own purpose. A pause inserted before every single sentence, regardless of its actual importance, quickly stops reading as deliberate emphasis and starts reading as an affectation, something the listener notices as a mannerism rather than experiencing as genuine weight. The skill lies in selectivity, reserving the pause for the handful of moments within any given conversation that genuinely warrant it, and allowing the rest of your speech to flow more naturally around those anchored points. This selective use is what separates a speaker who commands attention through pacing from one who has simply adopted a stylistic tic, and the difference is almost always immediately obvious to a listener, even if they could not explain exactly why one version feels genuine and the other feels performed. Chapter 10. Framing requests as value. Every request you make, whether it is asking for a raise, proposing an idea in a meeting, or simply asking a friend for a favor, can be framed in one of two fundamentally different ways. And the difference between these two framings often determines whether that request is met with enthusiasm or resistance, regardless of how reasonable the underlying ask actually is. This chapter is about the specific psychological skill of framing requests as value rather than as need, and why powerful people almost instinctively do this, while most other people default to the opposite pattern without ever realizing it. Consider the difference between these two ways of asking for the same thing. The first: I really need more resources for my team. We are struggling to keep up, and I am worried we are going to fall behind. The second: giving my team an additional resource would let us take on 2 more of the high-value projects currently sitting in the backlog, which I estimate would add significant measurable value to the department this quarter. Both requests are asking for the exact same thing: additional resources. But the first frames the request entirely around the requester's own struggle and need, while the second frames it entirely around the value that granting the request would produce for the other party. Listeners respond to these two framings in dramatically different ways, even when the underlying facts are identical, because human beings are wired to respond more readily to opportunities for gain than to obligations arising from someone else's difficulty. This is not a call to manipulation or dishonesty. If your team genuinely is struggling, that struggle is real and sometimes needs to be named directly, particularly with people you trust. But even when a genuine need exists underneath a request, there is almost always a legitimate value-based framing available as well. And finding it, rather than defaulting automatically to the need-based framing, dramatically changes how that request is received. This is because a need-based framing implicitly positions the requester as the one who benefits from a decision, and the listener as the one being asked to sacrifice or give something up. A value-based framing implicitly positions the decision as a mutual opportunity, something the listener benefits from as well, which fundamentally changes the psychological experience of saying yes. This principle extends into how powerful people communicate their own accomplishments and pitch their own ideas as well. Someone unfamiliar with this skill will often present a new idea by focusing heavily on how much work went into it or how excited they personally are about it, essentially asking the listener to validate their effort or enthusiasm. A more skilled communicator focuses the pitch almost entirely on what the idea does for the listener or the organization, framing their own effort and enthusiasm as secondary, supporting details rather than the central selling point. This is a subtle shift, but it consistently produces more genuine buy-in, because it respects the listener's actual priorities rather than asking them to prioritize the speaker's internal experience. There is a particularly important application of this principle in how boundaries and pushback are framed as well, because even a firm no or a difficult pushback can be framed around value rather than simply around personal limitation. Compare, "I cannot take on this additional project. I am already stretched too thin," with "taking this project on right now would mean the other priority projects slip, and I want to make sure we are protecting the ones that matter most this quarter. So let's talk about where this new one should actually sit in the sequence." The first framing centers entirely on the individual's personal capacity limits, which, while true, can read as simply an obstacle to be pushed past. The second framing centers on the shared priorities of the broader effort, positioning the pushback not as a personal limitation but as a form of genuine stewardship over what actually matters, which is far more difficult for the other party to simply override or dismiss. Building this skill requires developing the habit, before making any significant request or pushback, of pausing to ask yourself a specific question: what does the other party actually gain from saying yes to this, separate from simply relieving my own need or discomfort? Sometimes the honest answer is that there genuinely is no direct value to them. And in those cases, transparency about the actual need is the more honest and ultimately more respectful path, and attempting to force a value-based frame onto a request that genuinely has none will usually be sensed as manipulative rather than persuasive, which is precisely why this skill requires real discernment rather than blind application. But far more often than people initially realize, there is a legitimate value-based framing available, hiding just beneath the need-based one, and finding it before you speak, rather than defaulting automatically to the language of personal need, is precisely the shift that allows powerful communicators to consistently get more genuine, enthusiastic cooperation from the people around them, not because they are more entitled to it, but because they have simply learned to speak in the language the other party is actually listening for. Taken together, these 5 chapters form the second act of what we are building in this audiobook, the transition from the internal architecture of how powerful people think to the external architecture of how they actually speak. Silence, brevity, tonality, pacing, and value-based framing are not separate, unrelated tricks. They are 5 expressions of the same underlying quality: a genuine ease and command that no longer needs to prove itself through volume, speed, or over-explanation. And just as the mental shifts we covered earlier had to be built through repeated, deliberate practice rather than simply adopted overnight, these speech patterns require the same patient repetition before they become natural. What comes next takes everything we have covered so far: the internal calm, the frame control, the vocal command, and applies it to the final and perhaps most visible layer of power, the physical and social dynamics of the room itself. How powerful people move, how they read a space the instant they enter it, and how they hold control over an environment without ever needing to announce that they are doing so. Chapter 11. Reading the room before you enter it. Powerful people rarely walk into a space blind. Long before they say a single word, they have already begun gathering information, quietly and often unconsciously, about the dynamics they are about to step into. And this ability to read a room before fully entering it is one of the most underrated skills, separating those who control spaces from those who simply occupy them. This chapter is about developing that same awareness, learning to see the invisible architecture of a room before you commit yourself to any particular move within it. Every room you enter already has a structure, even if nobody in it could describe that structure out loud. There is usually a person, or a small handful of people, whose reactions others are quietly monitoring, whether through actual authority or simply social gravity. There is usually a current emotional temperature, tension, ease, boredom, excitement that has been building before you arrived and will continue shaping the interaction regardless of your own intentions. There are usually alliances and undercurrents: who is aligned with whom, who is bored, who is anxious, who is performing for someone else's benefit. None of this is announced. All of it is available to anyone willing to actually look for it, rather than walking in focused entirely on their own next move. The first skill here is simply slowing down enough to observe before acting. Most people, particularly when nervous, walk into a room and immediately begin executing whatever plan they had prepared in advance. Greeting people, delivering their opening line, moving toward their seat, without pausing even briefly to actually take in what is happening in the space. Powerful people build in a small window, sometimes only a second or two, sometimes longer if the stakes allow for it, where they simply observe before committing to their first move. In that window, they are gathering enormous amounts of information. The energy in the room, who seems to be in charge of the current conversation, whether the mood is tense or relaxed, whether their entrance has been noticed, and by whom. This brief pause before acting is not hesitation. It is reconnaissance, and it consistently produces better opening moves than rushing in on autopilot ever could. Consider what this actually looks like in practice. Someone walks into a meeting that is already underway, perhaps running a few minutes behind schedule. An unaware person, focused entirely on their own embarrassment at being late, will often rush to their seat, mumbling an apology, drawing more attention to their late arrival than necessary, and disrupting whatever momentum the room already had. A more aware person will take a half-second longer at the doorway, register the current tone of the conversation, whether it is tense, whether someone is midpoint, whether the room is actually relaxed and simply running long, and adjust their entrance accordingly. If the room is tense and focused, they might enter quietly, with minimal disruption, taking their seat without drawing unnecessary attention. If the room is relaxed, a brief, warm acknowledgement on the way to their seat might actually fit the existing energy rather than clashing with it. The content of the entrance barely changes. The awareness behind it changes everything about how it lands. There is a deeper layer to reading a room that goes beyond simply matching its existing energy, and this is where genuine skill begins to separate itself from mere social awareness. Powerful people are not only reading the room to fit into it, They are also reading it to identify where it actually needs something it is not currently getting. And this is often where their real value gets delivered. A room that has been circling the same unresolved tension for 20 minutes without anyone naming it directly does not need another person adding energy to the existing dynamic. It needs someone willing to name what everyone else has been avoiding, calmly and without unnecessary confrontation. A room that has grown scattered and unfocused, drifting away from its actual purpose, does not need more input. It needs someone willing to gently redirect attention back toward what actually matters. Learning to diagnose which of these a given room actually needs, rather than defaulting to a single fixed approach regardless of context, is a significant part of what allows certain individuals to consistently become the person a room turns toward at exactly the right moment. Reading a room also requires paying close attention to who is not speaking, not just who is. In almost every group setting, there are people whose silence carries meaning, whether because they hold real authority and are simply choosing to observe before weighing in, or because they have been quietly excluded or overlooked and have stopped trying to insert themselves into the conversation. Powerful people notice these silent participants and often, deliberately, find ways to draw them into the conversation, not out of pure altruism, though it often is genuinely considerate, but because doing so demonstrates a level of awareness and inclusiveness that the entire room registers, even if only unconsciously. This single move, turning to someone who has been quiet and genuinely inviting their perspective, is one of the fastest ways to be perceived as someone who holds real command over a room, because it signals that your awareness extends beyond simply managing your own position within the conversation. Building this skill requires practicing observation as a deliberate habit rather than something you only attempt occasionally. Before your next meeting, gathering, or significant conversation, make a conscious effort to spend the first few moments purely observing rather than contributing. Notice the energy in the room. Notice who seems to be setting the tone and who seems to be quietly reacting to it. Notice who has not spoken, and consider why that might be. This kind of observation feels, at first, like it is costing you time you could be using to make your own contribution. But in practice, the information gathered in those first few moments consistently improves the quality and timing of everything you say and do afterward, which is precisely why the people who seem to command the most respect in any given room are so often the ones who took the time to actually understand it before attempting to influence it. There is one final layer to reading a room worth naming, and it involves calibrating your read continuously rather than forming a single impression upon entry and holding on to it regardless of how the room actually evolves. Rooms are not static. The energy that greeted you at the doorway may shift entirely 10 minutes later as new information arrives, as different participants speak up, as the actual purpose of the gathering comes more clearly into focus. Someone who forms a fixed read early on and then continues operating from that outdated impression, even as the room has genuinely moved on, will often find their contributions landing oddly, slightly out of step with where the group's actual attention has shifted. Powerful people continue this same light, ongoing observation throughout an entire interaction, not just at its opening, treating their initial read as a starting hypothesis rather than a fixed conclusion, and remaining genuinely willing to update it as new information becomes available. This continuous recalibration is subtle, rarely noticed explicitly by anyone else in the room, but it is precisely what allows someone to remain in sync with a room's actual, evolving needs rather than simply executing a plan formed in the first 30 seconds and never revisited again. Chapter 12. Body language and physical presence. If the previous chapters have focused largely on the internal and verbal dimensions of power, this chapter turns to something more immediate and, in many ways, more primal: the physical body itself and the constant, wordless communication it produces the instant you enter any space. Long before anyone hears you speak, they have already begun forming an impression based purely on how you occupy physical space. And this impression, formed within seconds, is remarkably difficult to overturn later through words alone. The foundation of powerful physical presence is something surprisingly simple: economy and intentionality of movement. We touched on this briefly in an earlier chapter when discussing the illusion of effort, but it deserves a fuller examination here, specifically as it relates to how a body communicates status within a room. Anxious movement tends to be small, repetitive, and self-directed: adjusting clothing, touching the face, shifting weight from foot to foot, tapping a pen, crossing and uncrossing arms repeatedly. None of these movements communicate anything to anyone else. They exist purely to discharge internal nervous energy, and their cumulative effect, even if each individual movement seems minor, is to signal restlessness and discomfort. Powerful presence, by contrast, tends to involve fewer, larger, more deliberate movements. When a powerful person shifts position, gestures, or moves across a room, the movement tends to have a clear beginning and end, rather than the fidgety, half-completed quality of anxious movement, and crucially, there tends to be more stillness between movements, rather than a near-constant, low-level restlessness filling every silent moment. Posture carries an enormous amount of information as well, and much of it operates on a level far more ancient than conscious social calculation. Across cultures, and even across species, an expanded, open posture, shoulders back, chest open, occupying a reasonable amount of physical space, reads as confidence and status, while a contracted, closed posture, shoulders rounded forward, arms pulled tightly against the body, chin tucked down, reads as submission or anxiety. This is not a coincidence or a purely cultural construction. It maps directly onto how virtually all social mammals communicate dominance and submission physically. And human beings, despite our sophisticated language and culture, still read and respond to these same ancient physical signals, largely without conscious awareness. This means that even before you have spoken a single word, your posture has already begun establishing or undermining your perceived status within a room. It is worth being precise here, because expanded posture, taken to an extreme, easily tips into something that reads as aggressive or arrogant rather than confident, and this distinction matters enormously. The goal is not to make yourself as physically large as possible in every situation, puffing out your chest or spreading your arms wide across furniture in a way that crowds other people's space. That reads as insecure overcompensation just as clearly as a hunched, contracted posture reads as anxiety. And people are generally quite good at sensing the difference between genuine ease and performed dominance, even if they cannot articulate exactly what tips them off. The actual target is simply an open, relaxed, natural posture, shoulders down and back, without being forced, weight evenly distributed, chin level rather than tucked or tilted upward, occupying the amount of space that is natural and comfortable for your body without either shrinking away from it or aggressively expanding beyond it. Eye contact deserves its own careful examination, because it is one of the most powerful and most commonly mishandled elements of physical presence. Too little eye contact reads as anxiety, evasiveness, or disinterest. Too much, particularly unbroken, unblinking eye contact, reads as aggressive or unsettling rather than confident. The pattern used by genuinely powerful communicators tends to involve sustained but natural eye contact while listening, allowing the other person to feel fully seen and heard, combined with a comfortable willingness to break eye contact periodically without that break feeling like an anxious retreat. Crucially, powerful people also tend to maintain eye contact through moments that would make most people want to look away. The pause after asking a difficult question, the silence following an uncomfortable statement, a moment of disagreement. This willingness to hold eye contact through discomfort, rather than immediately glancing away the instant tension rises, is one of the clearest physical signals of the internal steadiness we discussed extensively in the earlier chapters of this audiobook. Because the body's instinct to look away under social pressure is difficult to override without genuine internal calm underlying it. Facial expression, particularly at rest, also communicates far more than most people realize. Many people carry a kind of low-level tension in their resting facial expression, a slight tightness around the eyes or mouth, without any conscious awareness that they are doing it. And this tension reads to others as guardedness or stress, even in otherwise neutral moments. Powerful presence often includes a genuinely relaxed, resting facial expression, not a forced smile, which can look just as unnatural as visible tension, but simply an absence of unnecessary tightness, jaw unclenched, forehead smooth, a face that looks at ease rather than braced for something. This, again, connects directly back to the internal work covered earlier in this audiobook, because a genuinely relaxed face is extremely difficult to produce convincingly if the underlying nervous system has not actually settled, which is precisely why so much of building lasting physical presence comes back, again and again, to the internal psychological shifts that everything else in this audiobook is ultimately built on top of. Breathing deserves specific mention here as well, because it is perhaps the single most immediate lever available for shifting physical presence in real time, and it is almost entirely overlooked by most people trying to improve how they carry themselves. Anxiety produces shallow, rapid breathing concentrated high in the chest, which in turn tightens the shoulders, thins the voice, and produces exactly the kind of restless, contracted physical presence we have been describing throughout this chapter as low status. Deliberately slowing the breath and allowing it to drop lower into the belly rather than staying high in the chest produces a nearly immediate physiological shift toward calm, which then cascades into every other element of physical presence. The shoulders drop naturally, the movements slow, the voice deepens. This is not a mystical technique. It is simply basic physiology. The nervous system reading the pattern of the breath as information about how much danger is actually present, and adjusting the rest of the body's tension accordingly. Because of this direct link, a few slow, deliberate breaths taken in the moments before entering a high-pressure room are one of the fastest, most accessible tools available for shifting your entire physical presence before you have said or done anything else at all. Chapter 13. Status Cues and Microsignals. Beyond broad posture and movement, there exists an entire layer of subtler physical and behavioral signals that human beings read constantly, almost entirely below conscious awareness, to assess relative status within any given interaction. This chapter examines these microsignals directly, because understanding them allows you to notice both what you might be unconsciously communicating and what others around you are communicating, often without realizing it themselves. One of the clearest status cues is what social scientists sometimes call territorial comfort, the ease with which someone occupies and moves through physical space that is not explicitly theirs. Someone low in perceived status within a given environment tends to move carefully, apologetically, minimizing their footprint, hugging the edges of rooms, keeping their belongings tightly gathered, hesitating before sitting somewhere that has not been explicitly designated for them. Someone with a settled sense of belonging, the same internal quality we discussed in the very first chapter of this audiobook, tends to move through the same space with far more natural ease, sitting comfortably, allowing their belongings to occupy a reasonable amount of space without excessive self-consciousness, and generally behaving as though the environment itself is neutral territory rather than something they need permission to exist within. This is precisely why the internal work around belonging discussed earlier in this audiobook translates so directly into physical status cues. The comfort is not performed. It is a natural physical expression of an internal state that has already been established before ever entering the room. Timing and responsiveness carry status information as well, and this shows up in ways many people never consciously notice. Lower status is frequently signaled by rapid, almost reflexive responsiveness, answering messages instantly regardless of the hour, immediately dropping whatever else is happening the moment someone of perceived higher status makes a request, visibly rushing to accommodate. This is not to say that responsiveness itself is a flaw. Genuine reliability and consideration matter enormously in real relationships and real work. But there is a meaningful difference between responsiveness that comes from genuine care and thoughtful prioritization, and responsiveness that comes from anxious, reflexive urgency and inability to tolerate the discomfort of someone waiting even briefly. Powerful people tend to respond thoughtfully rather than instantly, taking the time a given situation actually requires, rather than defaulting to maximum urgency regardless of context. And this measured pacing itself becomes a subtle status signal, communicating that their time and attention are being allocated deliberately rather than dispensed reflexively at the first request. Another important microsignal involves how people handle interruption and deference in conversation, patterns so automatic that most people never notice them happening in real time, either in themselves or in others. Lower status participants in a conversation tend to defer more frequently, yielding the floor quickly when interrupted, apologizing for talking too much even when they have said relatively little, laughing to smooth over moments of disagreement rather than allowing the disagreement to simply exist. Higher status participants tend to hold the floor more naturally when they have something to say, without excessive apology, and are more comfortable allowing genuine disagreement to remain unresolved in the moment, rather than rushing to smooth it over purely for the sake of social comfort. Watching for these patterns in any group conversation will very quickly reveal the actual felt status hierarchy operating within that group, which frequently has little to do with anyone's official title or role. Touch and physical proximity carry significant status information as well, though this is an area requiring real sensitivity and cultural awareness. Since norms vary considerably across contexts and cultures, in many settings, the ability to initiate appropriate physical contact, a handshake offered rather than waited for, a hand briefly placed on a shoulder in a moment of genuine connection, tends to correlate with higher perceived status. because initiating touch requires a level of social confidence that lower-status individuals often lack the comfort to display. Similarly, the person who is generally approached by others, rather than the one who must consistently approach, is frequently occupying the higher status position within a given social ecosystem, and this dynamic often shifts visibly and quickly as someone's confidence and internal sense of belonging develops, even without any change in their actual title, role, or circumstances. It is important to be direct about something before closing this chapter. Understanding these micro-signals is not an invitation to perform them mechanically. Forcing yourself to interrupt more, initiate more physical contact, or slow your responsiveness artificially in an attempt to manufacture status cues that do not reflect any genuine underlying confidence. Used this way, these behaviors tend to read as exactly what they are, a hollow performance rather than a genuine expression of internal ease. And people are, again, remarkably good at sensing this incongruence, even when they cannot name it directly. The real value in understanding status cues is diagnostic rather than performative. It allows you to notice, honestly, which of these patterns you currently default to under pressure, and to recognize that as those patterns shift naturally, as a genuine byproduct of the internal work covered throughout this audiobook, your physical and behavioral signals will shift right along with them, without ever needing to be consciously performed or maintained. Chapter 14. The Entrance and the Exit. Of all the moments within any interaction, two carry disproportionate weight in shaping how a room remembers and responds to you: the entrance and the exit. This chapter focuses specifically on these bookends because they are frequently rushed or given little conscious thought, even though they are, in many ways, the moments most heavily scrutinized by everyone else in the room, precisely because they are the transitions during which people are actively forming or finalizing their impression of you. Consider the entrance first. Most people, walking into a room, particularly one carrying any social pressure, unconsciously speed up, both physically and mentally, in an attempt to get through the vulnerable moment of arrival as quickly as possible. This produces a rushed, slightly frantic quality that, ironically, draws more attention to the entrance than a calmer approach ever would, precisely because rushed movement is visually distinct from the ambient pace of an already settled room. Powerful people tend to do the opposite. They enter at a measured, unhurried pace, even when internally they may feel some degree of nervousness. This does not mean moving artificially slowly, which can look strange and self-conscious in its own way. It means simply resisting the urge to accelerate through the discomfort of being newly visible, allowing your natural walking pace to remain steady rather than compressing under the pressure of feeling watched. The first few seconds of an entrance also involve a choice about where attention is directed, and this choice communicates a great deal. Someone anxious about being judged often enters a room scanning rapidly, eyes darting to assess how they are being perceived, which paradoxically draws more attention to their own self-consciousness. A more grounded entrance involves directing attention outward, toward the room and the people in it, rather than inward, toward monitoring one's own reception. This might look like briefly taking in the room, making natural eye contact with one or two people rather than everyone at once, and moving with a clear sense of purpose toward wherever you are actually headed, rather than hovering uncertainly near the doorway while deciding what to do next. There is also a specific skill in how powerful people handle the moment of being noticed upon entrance. Because in many settings, particularly ones where someone holds some degree of established respect or authority, heads do turn, at least briefly, when they walk in. The instinct for many people, uncomfortable with this attention, is to either ignore it entirely, avoiding eye contact and hurrying past, or to over-acknowledge it, performing an exaggerated greeting that draws even more focus than the moment already had. The more skilled approach involves a brief, genuine acknowledgement, a nod, a small smile, a simple greeting, delivered calmly, followed by a natural transition into whatever the actual purpose of the entrance was. This brief acknowledgement satisfies the room's need to feel seen and greeted, without turning the entrance itself into an extended performance. The exit deserves equal attention, and it is, if anything, even more frequently mishandled than the entrance, because by the time someone is leaving a room or ending a conversation, their energy has often already begun to fade, producing a trailing, uncertain quality that can undercut everything positive established earlier in the interaction. Consider how often conversations end with an awkward, drawn-out series of half-goodbyes. Someone announcing they should probably get going, then continuing to talk for another 5 minutes, then repeating the announcement, unable to actually commit to the exit they had already signaled. This pattern, sometimes called a leaking exit, comes from the same discomfort with clean, decisive action that we have discussed throughout this act of the audiobook. A difficulty tolerating the slight awkwardness of a clear ending in favor of a prolonged, softer, but ultimately messier departure. Powerful people tend to exit decisively once they have genuinely decided to leave. This does not mean their exits are cold or abrupt in tone. A warm, genuine closing remark, real eye contact, a clear, final acknowledgement of the person or people they are leaving. All of this can and should be present. What is absent is the repeated, uncertain announcing and re-announcing of the intention to leave, the hovering near the door while continuing to engage, the difficulty actually completing the physical action of departure once it has been verbally initiated. A clean exit, once decided, is executed relatively promptly, and this decisiveness, much like the decisiveness we discussed around ending conversational topics with clean silence, reads as a form of quiet confidence, a sense that this person's decisions, once made, are actually acted upon rather than perpetually renegotiated in real time. There is a final point worth making about exit specifically, because the way someone leaves a room is frequently what people remember most vividly afterward, simply due to the psychological principle that endings carry disproportionate weight in memory compared to the middle of any experience. A room that has spent an hour in a productive, engaging interaction with someone can have its overall impression subtly soured by an awkward, uncertain exit, just as a relatively ordinary interaction can be elevated significantly by a warm, clean, memorable closing moment. This means the exit is not simply a formality to be gotten through. It is, in many cases, the single most disproportionately influential moment in the entire interaction. And treating it with the same intentionality as the entrance, rather than allowing it to happen on autopilot, is one of the most immediately actionable shifts available to anyone working to build a more powerful, more memorable presence. There is a related skill worth mentioning before moving to the final chapter, and it concerns how powerful people handle the specific moment of transition between one conversation and the next within a larger event, a party, a conference, a networking gathering, where a single exit is immediately followed by a new entrance elsewhere in the same room. This back-to-back transition is where the discipline of clean exits matters most, because it is tempting, in a busy social environment, to let conversations trail off vaguely, drifting away mid-sentence toward the next interesting person, rather than actually closing the current conversation before opening the next one. This habit, though common, tends to leave a faint but real impression of carelessness on whoever is left mid-conversation. A more deliberate approach involves closing each conversation cleanly, even briefly, before moving on. A genuine acknowledgement that the conversation is ending rather than simply trailing off, which allows both the exit and the next entrance to carry the same intentionality we have been describing throughout this chapter, rather than blurring into a single, undifferentiated stream of half-finished social contact. Chapter 15. Holding the room under pressure. Everything covered throughout this audiobook, the internal detachment from approval, the frame control, the vocal command, the physical presence, is tested most rigorously not in calm, comfortable settings, but in moments of genuine pressure, when a room becomes tense, contentious, or unpredictable. This final chapter is about exactly that. Holding a room and holding yourself when the stakes rise and the easy version of composure is no longer available for free. Consider what actually happens inside a room when tension rises sharply. Whether from a heated disagreement, an unexpected confrontation, or a piece of genuinely bad news landing in real time. The room's collective nervous system activates. People look, often unconsciously, for a signal about how seriously to take the moment and how to respond to it, and in the absence of an obvious authority figure actively directing the room, that signal frequently comes from whoever appears most stable amid the rising tension. This is a critical insight, because it means that in moments of real pressure, composure is not simply a personal virtue. It becomes a kind of leadership, whether or not the person displaying it holds any formal authority in the room, because the entire group is, in that moment, unconsciously searching for a stable reference point to orient around. This is precisely why everything covered earlier in this audiobook matters most in exactly these moments. The gap between stimulus and reaction discussed in the chapter on the cost of reacting becomes the single most valuable skill available when a room turns tense, because whoever can create that gap, pausing rather than immediately escalating, responding rather than reacting, becomes the de facto stabilizing force in the room, regardless of their official position. Someone who has genuinely built the capacity to metabolize their own emotional charge, rather than either suppressing it or being hijacked by it, will, almost without exception, become the person the rest of the room instinctively turns toward as tension rises, simply because they are the only one in the room not currently being visibly destabilized by what is happening. Holding a room under pressure also requires a specific application of frame control that deserves direct attention here. In tense moments, there is frequently an implicit frame being offered. This is a crisis. This is a battle. Someone here needs to lose for someone else to win. And accepting that frame, even unconsciously, tends to escalate the situation further, because everyone in the room begins operating from the assumption that conflict is the only available mode. A powerful presence in a tense room often works, quietly and without announcing it explicitly, to offer an alternative frame. This is a problem to be solved together, This disagreement does not require anyone to lose face. There is a version of this outcome that actually serves everyone involved. This reframing rarely happens through a single dramatic statement. It happens through a series of smaller choices, a calm tone maintained even as others raise their voices, a genuine question asked instead of a defensive counterattack offered, a willingness to acknowledge a valid point made by an opposing party rather than reflexively defending every position. Each of these small choices chips away at the escalating frame and replaces it, gradually, with a steadier one. There is also an important skill here around naming tension directly, something most people instinctively avoid because it feels risky, as though acknowledging the tension out loud might make it worse. In practice, the opposite is frequently true. A simple, calm acknowledgement. Something like, "I can feel this conversation has gotten pretty tense. Let's slow down for a second," often does more to diffuse a charged room than continuing to plow forward, while everyone silently pretends the tension is not there. This works because unnamed tension tends to fester and compound, with each person privately escalating their own internal narrative about what is happening, while named tension becomes something the room can actually address directly, together, rather than something everyone is separately, silently managing on their own. Powerful people are frequently the ones willing to be the first to name what everyone else is already feeling but too uncomfortable to say out loud. And this willingness, delivered calmly rather than accusingly, is consistently one of the most respected and remembered moves available in any genuinely tense room. It is also worth addressing directly what happens when, despite everything covered in this audiobook, a powerful person still gets it wrong under pressure, because this happens to everyone, without exception, no matter how much internal work has been done. The difference between someone still building these skills and someone who has genuinely internalized them is rarely about never faltering. It is about how quickly and cleanly the recovery happens afterward. Someone without this training, having reacted poorly in a tense moment, often spirals further, compounding the original misstep with visible embarrassment, over-apologizing, or continuing to defend a position that has already clearly landed badly. Someone with genuine command over these skills recognizes the misstep quickly, often within seconds, and recovers cleanly. A brief, genuine acknowledgement, a reset in tone, a return to the calm baseline described throughout this chapter, without an extended, self-flagellating spiral that draws even more attention to the original mistake than it ever deserved. This capacity for quick, clean recovery is, in many ways, more valuable than the ability to never falter in the first place, because it is realistic and sustainable in a way that an expectation of flawless composure simply is not. There is one more dimension worth naming before this chapter closes, and it concerns what happens after the tense moment has passed. Once the room has settled and the immediate pressure has eased, many people, having navigated a difficult moment reasonably well, undercut their own composure afterward by over-processing it out loud, repeatedly circling back to what happened, seeking reassurance that they handled it correctly, or replaying the tension long after the room itself has moved on. Powerful people tend to let a resolved moment actually stay resolved, trusting their own read of the situation rather than needing continued external confirmation that things are actually fine. This final piece of restraint, The willingness to let a difficult moment close once it has genuinely closed is itself an extension of the same detachment from approval that opened this entire audiobook, and it is a fitting reminder that everything covered here ultimately traces back to that same single foundational shift. It is worth closing this chapter and this act of the audiobook with an honest acknowledgement that holding a room under real pressure is genuinely difficult, and it does not become easy simply because you understand the theory behind it. Every skill covered throughout this audiobook, the internal detachment, the frame control, the vocal steadiness, the physical presence, becomes dramatically harder to access, precisely when the stakes are highest and the temptation to abandon them in favor of pure reactive instinct is strongest. This is not a flaw in the material. It is simply the nature of any genuine skill, difficult in exactly the moments it matters most, and reliable only after enough repeated practice in smaller, lower-stakes situations that the nervous system has actually built real trust in these patterns before being asked to deploy them under maximum pressure. This is why every chapter throughout this audiobook has emphasized small, repeated, deliberately uncomfortable practice over any kind of instant transformation, because that is, in fact, the only path that actually produces the kind of steady, embodied power this entire audiobook has been describing. Closing. You now understand what actually separates the people who walk into a room and become its center of gravity from those who simply pass through it unnoticed. It is not luck, and it was never about title or position. It is a specific architecture, built from the inside out, beginning with a settled sense of belonging that does not depend on anyone else's approval, extending through the deliberate, unhurried rhythm of speech that signals genuine command rather than anxious performance, and completed by a physical presence that communicates ease and status without ever needing to announce itself. Every piece of this can be learned. None of it requires a personality transplant, and none of it requires becoming someone you are not. What it requires is the same thing that every genuine skill has ever required: honest awareness of where you currently default under pressure, and repeated, deliberate practice in small, survivable moments until what once felt forced becomes simply how you move through the world. Most people who listen to material like this will nod along, recognize themselves in a handful of the patterns described, and then return to exactly the same habits they walked in with, because understanding a pattern intellectually and actually rewiring it through repetition are two entirely different undertakings, and only one of them produces real change. You now know which one you are being asked to do. The question is not whether you understood this audiobook. The question is whether you are willing to walk into the next room that intimidates you and actually practice even one piece of what you just learned. The pause before reacting, the willingness to say less, the decision to enter without rushing. Do that consistently, in room after room. And the composure you have just spent this entire audiobook studying stops being something you observe in other people and becomes simply who you are the moment you walk through any door.